Over on Jaguar Gatorade, a new college football video is out. In this video, we talk about a bizarre controversy involving South Florida in 2002, and the weird way that they got invited to the Seattle Bowl. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. I want to give you a somewhat insane hypothetical situation, and I feel like I've started every video off like this for the past few days, so I apologize for using an example from this particular thing again, but it will help us to contextualize what's going on. Plus, I can't stop thinking about this game for obvious reasons. On Saturday night, the Jacksonville Jaguars will play the Tennessee Titans for the AFC South title. The winner is crowned the division champion, and the loser is likely out of the playoffs. For Tennessee, they're definitely out. And for Jacksonville, they're still mathematically alive, as unlikely as it is. Now let's say that on Saturday night, the Titans go ahead and win the game, breaking Jacksonville's hearts, winning the division, and making my life miserable in the process. The players are upset, the coaches are upset, the fans are upset, everyone in Duval is upset. The game ends at 11:30 p.m. Eastern. And then, at 1:30 a.m., the Jaguars get a call from the league office, and get a call from Commissioner Goodell. And on the call, Goodell says, "Congratulations, you're in the playoffs." Now you might be asking yourself, quite simply, how the heck this even happened? Literally no games happened in between the Jaguars-Titans game and the phone call. It's not as though this was a situation where the Jaguars thought they missed the playoffs, and then other games played out, and based on the results in those games, they realized they were in it. This was everyone thinking that they couldn't make the playoffs by losing this game right away, and even the league office thinking that they couldn't make it with a loss. And then, the league office calling a few hours after the game and saying, "Wait a second, our bad. Because of how the tiebreakers work, you're in no matter what happens the rest of the way." It's like if you're at Disney World, and you want to ride Space Mountain, and you're too short for the ride. Then 5 minutes later, with the same person working, with the same outfit and shoes on, you try again, and you're not too short anymore. Literally nothing changed in between, yet the outcome was different. Something like that seems unthinkable, right? Well, as absurd as this might sound, in 1982, that's exactly what happened to this team right here, the Minnesota Vikings. Because in 1982, after a loss to the New York Jets, quite literally everyone thought that they blew their shot at clinching a playoff spot. However, as it turned out, even though nothing changed after the game, and there were no games taking place afterwards that could have had any impact on the outcome, the Vikings found out that they made the playoffs in the most bizarre of ways, where their reaction was understandably one of mass confusion instead of celebration. Because this is the story behind what has to be, considering the circumstances, one of the craziest playoff scenarios of all time. Before I talk about the actual situation in question, we need some context to understand the team in question, how they were doing, the importance of the game that they were about to play, and perhaps most importantly, how the game itself was going. The year is 1982, and everything is completely messed up, in case you haven't been able to figure out by the hundreds of videos I've done on this season already, of which I've linked a playlist that you can access by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And because of the strike-shortened season, the entire format of the season was changed. Instead of playing 16 games, only 9 games would be played. Instead of 5 teams in each conference making the playoffs, 8 teams would make it. And screw it, it's not called the playoffs anymore. It's called the Super Bowl tournament. And entering what was technically Week 16, but in reality was Week 8, one of those teams competing for one of the 16 spots in the Super Bowl tournament and one of 8 spots in the NFC was the team you've been watching this whole time, the Minnesota Vikings. Oddly enough, this is not the first time I've done a video on the 1982 Vikings, as if you want to learn more about their opening game of the season, which was a victory against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, click the card in the upper right corner. Through the first 7 games of the season, they were playing some pretty good football, having won their last 2 and 3 of their last 4. Now, by no means were the Vikings an especially great football team, as they sat at 4-3, hadn't beaten a good team yet, being the beneficiaries of a relatively easy schedule thus far, and were in the middle of the pack across the league in offense and defense. However, there were some bright spots as they were trying to make this late playoff push of theirs. Quarterback Tommy Kramer had thrown 9 touchdowns in the past 4 weeks, playing some of the best football of his career. The defensive line was generating a ton of pressure, getting at least 7 sacks in 2 of their last 4 games. And the run defense was superb, allowing under 3.5 yards per carry in each of their last 4 games, including just 42 yards on 2.3 yards per carry against the Lions in their previous game. The field for the 1982 playoffs was going to be super weak and super inclusive, but the Vikings were proving that they deserved to be one of the 8 in the conference to have a shot at this thing. And that brings us to the game in question. It's December 26, 1982, the day after Christmas. It's the penultimate week of the NFL season, and we've got a monumental battle on our hands between the New York Jets and the Minnesota Vikings. The importance of this game for the Vikings cannot be overstated, and not just because the Jets were one of the best teams in the NFL, entering at 5-2 with the 3rd best offense and the 2nd best point differential in all of football. For Minnesota, if they won this game, they would be in the Super Bowl tournament. Anyone who finished above 500 was just about guaranteed to make the playoffs that year. So if you can win that game and get to 5-3, then you're sitting pretty, and positioning yourself to host a playoff game, or maybe even 2, depending on what happens in the first round. However, if you lose this one, then not only do you drop to 4-4, with your playoff hopes being more up in the air, but the odds that you win your final game of the season, which is against the Dallas Cowboys, as in the team with the best record in the NFL, are relatively slim. You don't want to put your faith and your playoff chances in the hands of beating the Cowboys on the final day of the season. Granted, beating the Jets is not an easy feat by any means either, seeing as they've only lost 4 of their last 20 games dating back to the 1981 season. But you would much rather take your chances there than against the Cowboys. As for how this game turned out, oh boy, it was bad. It was very, very bad. It's funny because the Vikings actually didn't play that poorly. They were churning out long, sustained drives on the Jets. Outside of a few chunk plays here and there, the defense was playing pretty well, and they even forced a fair bit of pressure, recording 3 sacks and holding the Jets to under 4 yards a carry. The Vikings dominated in the time of possession, with the Jets holding onto the ball for about 8 minutes in the first half, and just 21 minutes and 43 seconds total. And in terms of total yardage, the Vikings outgained the Jets 484 to 324, while in total first downs, the Vikings won that battle 28 to 15. Really, if you watch this game, the Vikings did not play that poorly, nor did the Jets play that great. However, the final score said otherwise, as thanks to a pick six, a fake field goal for a touchdown, a blocked field goal that was returned for a touchdown, albeit very controversially, and a touchdown scored on offense by the Jets after getting an extremely short field thanks to picking off a Tommy Kramer pass and taking it down near the goal line, the Jets won 42-14. It was a 28-point blowout in a game where the Vikings just shot themselves in the foot every chance they got. Seriously, every mistake the Vikings made, the Jets capitalized on it. Some 4-touchdown blowouts are just a matter of the other team being better, or the losing team not showing up. And some of them, like this one, are just frustrating affairs where they should have been close, and it was close on the field, but there were just so many sloppy things happening, and the Jets capitalized on all of it, including the play of quarterback Tommy Kramer, who had to throw 56 times and finish with a passer rating of just 57.7, which was more than 25 points worse than his season average at that point. It was not a good performance. The loss was absolutely devastating, and not just because it was a blowout, and not just because it was the first time ever that the Vikings lost a game, regular season or postseason, at the Metrodome, their home stadium that opened up that season. And it wasn't just because they felt like they let one get away from them by playing some really poor football, with defensive end Doug Martin capping off the performance by comparing it to a snowball, saying it was like a snowball, gradually building into a gigantic one. All of a sudden, we were covered by it. We rolled around and tried to get out of it, but we couldn't. But rather, It was devastating because now the Vikings had a significant uphill climb to make the playoffs. Their hopes were hanging on by a thread. They were 4-4. The odds of beating the Cowboys weren't great. And the odds of making the playoffs at 4-5, becoming the first team to ever make it with a losing record, without having to depend on a bunch of other things to go your way, were pretty poor. This was a season, a short one at that, but a season nonetheless, that got away from the Vikings. Fans left the stadium upset. Coaches left the stadium upset. Players left the stadium upset. And then, a few hours after the game, they got a phone call from the NFL. Which raises the question, what was the phone call about? Turns out, we did the math, and you guys are in the playoffs. Whoops. That's right, the Vikings, without anyone realizing it, made it to the playoffs and clinched a spot in the Super Bowl tournament. And I want to clarify that it's not because anything else happened. It would be one thing if the Vikings got in with a win or a loss by another team, and they didn't realize until after their game that the other team lost. That happens all the time. That's not a story. I mean that at 7 o'clock Eastern, the Jets-Vikings game ended, and the Vikings had not clinched a playoff spot. At 7:30, the Vikings still had not clinched a playoff spot. At 8 o'clock, still nothing. At 8:30, still nothing. And at 9 o'clock, despite nothing happening around the NFL, the Vikings had a playoff spot locked up. You see, the 1982 season was bizarre in more ways than one. And one of the insane ways that this season worked was that because of the confusing and unprecedented nature of it, calculating tiebreakers on the fly and trying to figure out what the deal was at any given moment was about as effective as asking a 5-year-old to do calculus. It was going to take some time. It was going to be frustrating. They would have no idea what was going on or what to do. They have no idea if they would even be doing this right. And they would still get the answer wrong. That's exactly the problem that the Pittsburgh Steelers faced during that same week, when they thought they were in the playoffs. And the league flat out told them that they were in the playoffs, only for them to retract their statement and say that they weren't in the playoffs. You can learn more about that scenario by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Which raises the question, how did the NFL determine that the Vikings clinched a playoff spot? Well, to break any tie in conference play amongst more than two teams, the tiebreaker used is conference record. The better your winning percentage in the conference is, the better your chances at making the playoffs are. In other words, if you're going to lose, and you're the Vikings, it's way more beneficial to lose against AFC teams than it is to lose against NFC teams. Where this got tricky was because this was 1982, and 7 games were canceled. Each team had an uneven number of conference games. Some teams played 8 conference games, some played 5. You get the idea. It was a jumbled mess. And entering the final week of the season, here's how every team with 3 or 4 wins in the NFC looked. They were fighting for 3 remaining spots. In this scenario, let's assume that the Vikings lose to the Cowboys and fall to 4-5 in the final week of the season. This means that, in the NFC, they would have wins against Tampa Bay, Chicago, and Detroit, and losses against Green Bay and Dallas. Minnesota had 4 games against the AFC, playing the Bills, Dolphins, Colts, and Jets. So their schedule with regards to the lack of conference games was especially weird. If the Vikings lost to the Cowboys, then their conference record would be 3-2, with a winning percentage of 60%. And let's assume that the Buccaneers win their final game of the season and go to 5-4, so they leapfrog the Vikings. With 2 spots on the table, that means that so long as 2 other teams do not have a conference winning percentage greater than 60%, the Vikings are in. This means that we have to assume, because this is the worst case scenario, that all 6 teams at 3-5 win their games. If the Giants went to 4-5, then they would be 3-5 against the NFC, winning 37.5% of their games. The Vikings own the tiebreaker. If the Eagles went to 4-5, then they would be 2-4 against the NFC, winning 33% of their games. The Vikings own the tiebreaker. If the Bears went to 4-5, then they'd be 3-4 against the NFC, winning 42.8% of their games. the Vikings own the tiebreaker. If the Lions went to 4-5, then they'd be 4-4 against the NFC, winning 50% of their games. The Vikings own the tiebreaker. If the Saints went 4-5, then they'd be 3-5 against the NFC, winning 37.5% of their games. The Vikings own the tiebreaker. And if the 49ers went 4-5, then they'd be 3-2 against the NFC, just like the Vikings. Only the 49ers even had a shot at having a winning percentage in conference play that was greater than or equal to the Vikings. And seeing as there were 2 spots left, in the absolute worst case scenario, where everyone below them wins and the Vikings lose, the Vikings still get in the playoffs. The only problem? No one at the time knew that. None of the players or team officials knew that. The league didn't know that. It was only hours after the game ended that the NFL realized, hey, wait a second, the Vikings are in. We should let them know. Center Dennis Swilly was at his house after the game, lamenting the loss, when he got a call from the league saying that he was going to be in the playoffs. As Swilly said, I couldn't believe it. I didn't think the possibilities would work out like that. And Swilly wasn't the only one. Reports indicate that when the team left the stadium late that night, Bud Grant and the rest of the players had no idea that they were in the playoffs. They went to bed thinking that they were screwed, and woke up the next day learning that they were in the playoffs, even though quite literally, nothing happened in between that stretch. Sunday Night Football, at least in its current form, did not exist back then. Once the 4 o'clock games were done, barring some special occasions, that was it. This truly was an absurd way to find out that you clinched a playoff spot. And the fact that no one, not one single person anywhere, knew about it during or immediately after the game was absolutely shocking, and just showed how awful and chaotic of a state the league was in during this 1982 season. When a team finds out that they made it to the playoffs, not only does everyone know about it, and not only is everyone made aware of it, but it calls for a celebration of some kind, and some acknowledgement of the hard work that they did to get to this point and establish themselves as one of the best teams in football. But in 1982, at least when it came to the Minnesota Vikings, that was not the case. Because in 1982, when the Vikings got the phone call to inform them that they were in, they were absolutely confused. Turns out, if the Diggs playoff catch in the 2017 divisional was the Minneapolis Miracle, then determining the playoff fate of the Vikings in 1982 was the Minneapolis Mess. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.